Awesome. Okay. So on today's schedule, the goal here is to record 2 or 3 tutorial videos for the Phalcon project. Um, I have found that the best way for me to do this is with a screen capture with QuickTime on my Mac. It does kind of mean that I generally have to go through it in one go, but um, that's kind of okay. So for fun, I put the 24mm on the C100, and so here's how this is working. So I'm currently streaming from that machine over there, right, which is my Lenovo Y70. So it's kind of like my under $1,000 gaming laptop, and it's okay. I love everything about it except the keyboard. But in fact, the internal hardware is top notch. Now, so the C100 is not actually recording. I'm just using it for live. I'm using the live monitor output from it into an Elgato HD60S, no, an HD60, which has a hardware H.264 encoder in it. So that's going into the Lenovo over USB. So that's how you get my face in the corner, of course. So camera's here, and I'm over there, and that's why you keep getting the little clicking sounds. That's the 24mm autofocused. It's a cheaper lens, so it's Canon EF mount, but it's not a USM, it's not an L lens or anything like that. So you're gonna hear a lot of that, and that's the trade-off. So then the audio for the videos will come through an H2N hand recorder, which I use at 48 kilohertz as a streaming microphone to my Mac. So really, there's going to be 2 amounts of information going on here, and it's going to be some fun. So so you can see the screen on my Mac on the other machine. I have real VNC running, and I've cropped it. So you're only seeing one of my screens over here. So I've got like the Phalcon tutorial and my loopback configuration and Discord in case you want to ask me questions. That's on my other monitor, and there's just no reason for you to see it. So you're gonna get to see live what I'm recording while I record it, and I've also time synced the audio since the C100's audio stream is going through an H.264 encoder, which puts a little bit of a delay on it, about 1.1 milliseconds delay, and or 1.1 seconds is the average encoding delay. And then VNC is actually quite good, and it does compositing, so in fact it doesn't even send any data whenever I'm not moving and nothing's changing on the screen. So I have the audio 95% synced up with how it's going through VLC, so that's going to be pretty cool. So the outcome of these videos will then be posted, I think, on the Phalcon Framework YouTube channel. But I wanted to do these kind of, maybe get some real-time feedback from you guys as I'm doing them, but at the same time, I want to not just directly upload these. So streaming helps give me an opportunity to not feel so pressured to immediately upload it. I'll probably pass it through, iMovie or something. I have what's it called? Lightworks, and I might in the end just use my wife's Adobe Premiere. I keep threatening to do so. I just also don't want to learn how to use Premiere, although I did spend probably 2 hours one day learning how Lightworks works, and at the end found out that the free version only lets me export a 720p video, which was okay because it was just a slide deck with like a talking head over it. That was cool, but had I done some significant work there and been locked into that, I'd been pretty upset. So let's get started. I'll show you this window to start with, just so that we kind of have a same starting point. So this is the tutorial portion of, it's going to be a bad habit. I'm going to keep looking at that other computer and as if somehow I don't trust that it's going to continue recording or something. So apologies. So I recently went through and revised this document. I'm probably going to revise it again because I think it could still be shorter. And so as kind of an attempt to try that out, there's going to be 2 flows to the videos today. So this initial document is like from nothing with nothing. I have a file system and an editor, and I can make a Phalcon project, which is great. What I'm going to try to work towards, though, is to really start at the I have Phalcon dev tools and then use the standard application template. This is almost the same as the standard application template. I believe that the application template includes like a nice config structure and some other kind of like what we're starting to approach as a normal Phalcon project. As we all know, and if you haven't, it's in the documentation. The general structure of Phalcon is mutable, right? You can wire it up any way you want because deep down it's really well decoupled. But because more and more projects are going to continue to come out using Phalcon, and we're going to expect people are going to want to know how to use it, starting to promote this or continuing to promote this idea of a standard project template so you feel comfortable when you enter in a collaborative space is going to be a benefit to everybody. So I'm going to do the whole tutorial from scratch, but I'm going to do that 1 second because I think I can just cut in between once I get to the view portion of this document, because the basic loader should do everything up until, I mean, it technically already creates the index controller, so I could start here at the creating controller section, and I think that's going to probably work out pretty well. Yeah. Oh, that's right. And in case you didn't read the notes on the video, if you want to ask me questions when I'm not necessarily in a recording session, I'll be on Discord, and there's a link in the notes to the Phalcon's Discord channel, and I should show up as Ninja Panzer in there. And I'm in the general room right now, but you can also feel free to private message me. Obviously, if I'm in the middle of recording a segment, I won't respond to your question immediately, but as soon as that's done, I'll try to get to them. So don't get me wrong, I don't know everything, but you know, my hope is that if I don't get it, someone else will be in chat, and they'll help me out. All right, I think I have to do one more sound test with the with my voice recorder, and then I'm gonna start the I have dev tools, and I'm starting a project thing. So, you know, stick around, it'll be fun. Okay. Oh, I can drop these headphones eventually. Hey, test, test, okay. Let's see. Test, So in case you're curious as to what I'm doing, I'm just trying to, the microphone is right here. I don't know if it's actually on camera. It's like maybe right off of camera. And yeah, you know, I do this, so I try to like hide it a little bit. It's got a little red light on it. The goal here is I need to be able to hear me, but I have an air conditioner running. Now I've done a pretty good job on the C100, and you probably hear a tiny warble in the background when I'm talking, but it's probably almost indistinguishable. This microphone, though, is definitely not as adjustable as the C100s. So I have to use a program called Loopback, which lets me bring the audio into a program that has VSTs and filters, and then I can capture the output source of that program and treat it as if it's a virtual audio device, and then I can get QuickTime to pick up that audio device. So it lets me do some filtering. Now, in the end, because it's so close to me and I'm in between the air conditioner and the microphone, I'm going to block most of the sound, and I'll just, when I get it through my video editing platform, I'll do a noise suppression, which should help knock out everything on the very, very bottom end of that little bit of hum. Anyways, I can drop these headphones, which makes me super happy. Yeah. I don't want to make any feedbacks. All right, so if you are wearing headphones, the risk factors you have are I have a mechanical keyboard and a bad habit of kneeing the desk. So let's see how this goes. All right, let's get my terminal up. All right, so we'll start here. I think this is a good enough starting point. And I don't have any of the sub windows open, do I? Nope. All right, anything that's notifying me aside from Discord. Doesn't seem like it. Everything going on in Chrome that I have to worry about. And can I... And we'll just turn off notifications for a little bit. Okay, let's get started. So... Test. Okay. Everybody hold their butts. I'm going to try to do this in one take. Or as close to one take as possible. One take, one take. Anyways, alright. Stop clicking. Hey everybody. So today we're going to try to do a, we're going to try to walk through the tutorial on the Phalcon website. So that's docs.phalconphp.com. There's a getting started section, or a tutorial section below getting started. And we're going to be going through the one named basic. Now what basic is going to give us is a working sample application. And we're going to try this using Phalcon DevTools. So while this particular tutorial does start with the whole file structure rundown, I think that we can probably move past most of that since the DevTools provide us a functional template for our project. So fair warning, I'm going to be using a mechanical keyboard. There's going to be a lot of clicky clacks. I will try to keep the slapping of the spacebar to a minimum. And, you know, so hold your ears in case. You might want to turn it down a little bit. I promise you I will be adjusting the audio slightly before you actually get this. So, the condition that I'm starting in is I have Phalcon DevTools installed, I have Phalcon installed, and I have PHP 7. I think I'm 7.0.1.2. We could be using 7.1, and 7.2 is coming out pretty soon. The idea then, of course, if this is the first thing you've seen, is that since Phalcon is delivered as a C extension, that means that it's been added as an extension to your PHP INI file. You've either downloaded that from the Phalcon website or you've compiled it yourself if you're so daring. I mean, admittedly, the first time I did this, I did compile it myself. It was pretty sweet. So I won't deny that I probably would do that again. You know, 5 stars would install again. I might be a little biased. Phalcon DevTools is command line tools. So I made another video that you should watch, and I'll put a link to that, which just gives you a rundown of really the commands we're going to follow here. So let's start with Phalcon, or yeah, the command is just Phalcon once they've been installed, and they'll look a little something like this. Now we're going to use the project command and then probably the serve command eventually. So project allows us to define a project type and a location, and it'll install that project there. So we're going to do this real quick. This is the best part. Phalcon project, and we're going to call this tutorial 1, and it's going to be a simple, and we're going to have that folder created right here in my Phalcon test folder where I've been collecting all my test projects. So this scaffolded us an index, and then also created a the project folder for us. Now, right now we don't have database connection, so I'm not going to worry about that part. And I have Sublime text open, which I have built in, or I've added with the subl command that I've aliased. So I'm just going to open up this project this way. So we're going to go to tutorial 1, and then I have a command subl dot. Which opened the project right here. All right, so some of the key things that you'll notice, especially if we were to go to the very beginning of the tutorial, is we have a pretty common folder structure. So the app folder is where all of our source code is going to go. Cache folder is for asset compilation. This mostly out of the box deals with how Volt, the templating engine, creates a PHP template caches, just to save time on re-rendering. And then the public folder, which is where all of our static assets will live. And so there's a really strong separation here with only one executable file, which is the kind of the pattern that the PHP MVC framework follows usually, where we have one entry point which relies on the server's request URI as its kind of like way of identifying how to break up the rest of the request. And then we also get this HT router, which allows us to utilize the PHP built-in server for local testing. So the things that are different, if you're looking at the tutorial side by side here, is that while we have controllers, models, and views, what is missing is config and library and migrations, which, to be honest, as a beginner, you probably won't need, but as you grow within this framework, you're absolutely going to immediately want to start using migrations of some sort. And you're going to want to probably try to externalize your config a little bit. Now, I think that the config loaders that they have provided are actually somewhat hard to follow, so we're not going to bother going through them. But I don't think we're going to have to make that many config changes, but that'll be another video explaining that portion. Traditionally, the way that a Phalcon app is configured, so as we move down from the file structure and start looking at the autoloaders portion, we have to tell it where our file assets are. And those specifically are the controllers and the models. And it's this ability to identify the location of your autoloader resources, things that should be autoloaded, is really what makes this so modular, is it doesn't really matter. There's no preconception as to what these folders should be, even though there's nothing wrong with there being a preconception for it. So in this particular index.php file, which is where the bootstrap is built, in the tutorial, we see that they have this register directory command, which is it accepts an array of the directories relative to the index.php file where something that is named that you would want to auto-load exists. Now, what's cool about this autoloader, just as an underlying understanding, if you're using Composer, for example, which also supports PSR4 autoloading, it creates an autoloader PHP script and keeps track of where those assets are located so that there's some kind of naming convention so that when you request something, it gets inserted into the namespace correctly. That all happens in PHP. And while that's not a huge deal, that does mean that you're doing file traversal and file access, and it could be faster. Because in no way am I saying Composer is slow. I think that they've done a great job. But this PSR4 autoloader is written in C. So it actually is a little bit lower, closer to the file system, and PHP isn't going and getting your files. Your C code, a native code, is going and getting your files and loading them. That's definitely going to increase overall performance at auto load time. So in here, the loader has been loaded at a little bit later in the file, not the first thing. And so app path is, of course, where our application exists. And then, so for us, it's /app. It's so that we don't have to do this ... slash. We could replace app path with ... slash and have the same effect. So we're going to go to config and then loaders. So let's take a look at that file, just so we can see what the template looks like. So in this case, we're going to call to config, and then application, we have the controllers directory and we have the models directory. So the config file here is where that lives. And as you can see, the application directory is root, the controller directory is controllers, the model directory is models. It's all not that exciting, really, when you think about it. And it's 3 files that the system accesses as opposed to 1. So that's why it's a little bit more complicated. But what's nice about this is it's already set up the way the tutorial runs through out of the box. So guess what? Even though you probably should learn how this works, you could skip this step and already be running. So the next is dependency management. So the DI concept is hand in hand with a thing called inversion of control. It means that when something you have that acts as a service or component within your application is a new instance is created, it automatically has dependencies in which it requires injected into it. Now, in some IOC setups, dependencies are qualified by name and by type and then injected specifically. And they're usually a shared resource, which means that services and components that are injected are singletons. Or if they're not explicitly singletons, they are a file that, or they are a class that's only going to be instantiated once. And Phalcon's DI container has the same options of setting shared and also getting new on demand. Now, because PHP is not a strongly typed, right? We have type hints, but there's no requirement. It would be difficult outside of explicit naming conventions to infer which dependencies need to be injected at instance creation time. So the container acts more as a bag of those dependencies. So they've been instantiated once, and now they're made available through the scope of the component. So the DI container effectively wraps the component or controller or something like that, something that we've auto-loaded, and then gives you access to them as if they were they're an extension of the class. Now, ultimately, there's plenty of ways of doing inversion of control. The important part is that you've controlled where and how dependencies should be resolved outside of your class. Whether that's done in some fancy way like Java does with Spring, where everything is named and inserted as needed for garbage collection purposes, we could probably expand to that, but it's not really idiomatic to PHP to have that as a true thing. So it's a little bit more like your loaded components have luggage, and that luggage is configured in the DI container at bootstrap time. So the application has an alias for factory default, which the template project also provides, and that's this on line 15 here, where we say DI equals new factory default. What factory default does under the hood is actually just instantiate most of the common DI services that the average application needs. In our tutorial, we specifically define a view container, a view service, which I believe in this case is handled by config services.php. So let's go take a look at that one. So in this case, where we've put this in the index.php in the tutorial, here in our Bootstrap project using DevTools, we have set shared view. Now we're using shared. That means view will be instantiated as a single instance, like a singleton, and then will be continuously reused. Now, just to go a little bit further into that, any class that you can instantiate can be made as a shared dependency. So don't feel that services in the DI container have to be something magical. They can be, popos, plain old PHP objects, and they need to have a constructor that you can meet at DI setup time, and that has a doesn't manage any state that would be per request, per subsequent request. Like a static class has some benefit here in this point. I don't know if I'd go so far as worrying about facades. I think that's an over abstraction. But anyways, so here's our view component, which has been configured now. It already knows where the app view location is because that's configured, but it's also going to set up caching. So there's going to be compiled cache, which we're again going to get from the config, and that's going to be called the cache directory. Of course, the view directory also came from the config. So one of the benefits now of added complexity of these additional configuration files is that we reduce some of the duplication by having all of our text kind of like hand-entered configuration in one place, and then we can reference it elsewhere. We could use constants. Anything except globals and superglobals would be acceptable at this point. The default view engines registered in this manner are Volt and PHTML. By default, the system or the tutorial sets up, I think, just PHTML. Yeah, we don't have a Volt configuration. We just add a view component. Okay, so next, the tutorial sets a base URI. Now, this would allow, if you were creating more than one module in your PHP application, you could have more than one application under the same root, and then have each one configured, each entry point. So it's possible that you could have index 1, index 2, index 3, or let's say tutorial.php and so on. And your web server, based on however your name-based virtual hosting is, could point that application to its own individual folder. And it could share some of their configuration, their DI container, and other resources. So in the case of this would transform the request URL. They would need to match against the domain / tutorial / whatever your controller route action pattern ends up being. For the sake of this, I think that's a little unnecessary, and that's one of the things I'm considering on revising. So we've configured our application should run, and then at the very end we are going to spin up the application. So we do application equals new Phalcon MVC application DI, and then we replace some characters just for the sake of readability, and we handle the requests, and then we return whatever the content, which is the full processing of all the possible rendered templates. So that puts everything together. So really we're going to start writing code at the creating a controller section. Now, as we remember by looking at the console output, it actually already created us an index controller and a base controller for them to all inherit from. The index controller, of course, though, is empty. So we're going to go ahead and follow along from here. So we need to echo something to be displayed on the screen. All right. And I think my indentation's a little off. There we go. Now, at this point, we're going to spin up the Phalcon DevTool server with the command Phalcon serve. Now, it automatically knows to go look for the htrouter.php file and set the document base as public, and then it's going to expose that on 0.0.0.0 port 8000. It's all configurable from the command line. So I'm going to bring in a window here in a minute. And I think I need a return here. Instead of an echo. Yes. So because we have Volt configured, the default action for any request will be to try to find the Volt template, compile it, and then render it. So I want to bypass that real quick since we're not quite there yet, and we're going to do that right now. So I instead return a string from the controller, which bypasses the next step of processing. If we didn't have anything besides the view layer injected, echoing at this point would continuously begin to build the response. So let's go ahead and move this into our Volt layer. This follows a very standard construction. Controller name has a suffix controller, and that is how the autoloader knows that it gets the dependency injection handled the way it does. It knows it's a controller. All actions have to be suffixed with action, and that uses those naming conventions to figure out what the route will be. So, index, of course, is a special alias for the root. So it'll just be the slash, or in the case of canonical naming, nothing. And also the index route is a special alias, meaning that if I went to a particular controller but did not provide an action, that should be the default handler. Actions are handled. They are act as handlers for requests. So we use that naming convention for dealing with how to route. It also is how we resolve. So we go to the views folder, we look for the controller name minus the suffix. We look for the action name minus the suffix. That returns us the view that will be rendered. This is a pretty common occurrence in most MVCs that are done in a convention over configuration kind of way. So just so you can see, if I don't have anything in the controller and I produce just this portion, that is what I'm going to see. I'm going to see that properly rendered template. It needs to have this Volt extension for Volt to pick it up. Now Volt has a special syntax for providing access to variables, and that's what gives it some benefit. If we converted this to PHTML, our view engine would render that as well, and it would deal with it as a PHP engine template. So we could have, it would be just like a PHP file that we're used to in the olden days, where our template and our logic live together with PHP tags. So let's go ahead and make this look like the tutorial now. And now we're going to add a little extra. All right, so what do you guys think? Should we keep this PH thing going and say flying or flying? It's really that easy, and that's one of the really strong benefits that I think you're all going to really enjoy when you get used to this. All right, so we've been able to create our index controller. We've provided our output. If we want to see the PHTML variant of that, let's go ahead and change this to PHTML. Now, this won't work anymore. I believe that we will get a PHP parsing error. No, it looks like it's still happy with us. But we should also be able to echo inline now. And the least dynamic thing I could think of should be able to go in there. Well, it looks like it, oh, that would make sense. I didn't close my... You know, we'll just move this to the bottom, and then I don't have to worry about closing it. So PHTML allows us to write regular inline PHP code if you so choose. The rendering process is kind of like either one of them becomes a renderable PHP file. If you write it in Volt, the created cache object, let's see if we got one. So this is what our Volt looked like. It rendered it down to a regular PHP file, which since it has no PHP executable sections, it's just a regular text file, and there's no parsing to be done. In the event that we had something dynamic, though, we would have seen this turn into the PHTML syntax, which is in effect just a PHP file. All right, so let's go back to Volt. Let's just leave this alone. We can absolutely change it whenever we feel like it. All right. So now we're going to do a sign up form. So on the index page, we are going to add a, and we're going to do this in PHTML so we can stay as close to the structure of the tutorial as possible at this point. We can always try to convert this to Volt when we're done. So to save everyone from listening to my clicky keyboard, I'm going to do a little copy pasta. So we're going to say hello. We're going to produce two end-of-line characters, and then we are going to say this.tag.linkTo, which is a special tool that's been injected to the DI container that's actually been registered as part of factory default. So we did not configure this one ourselves, but it is available to us because it is so common. It will produce a link to the route sign up with the text sign up here. Let's see how that looks. You could have absolutely put an anchor tag outside of the PHP constraints and then written the exact same thing. Like there's nothing particularly fancy going on here. Although I am confused about the URL it's producing, because it should be producing this, which obviously is not resolvable. So I think it's because we are missing a leading slash. That's still not right either. Well, now at some point I'll probably have to cut this video. So there was where our first pain point happened. It's bound to happen. So I'm glad you get to enjoy watching it with me. So for some reason our tag is creating the incorrect tag. Let's go ahead and bring this back to something that makes more sense. So it looks like the local server possibly is trying to affix this index PHP at route time. Which is odd to me because this is where we're executing from. But the link being produced does include index.php/signup. So there's some confusion that I'm going to have to resolve there. It is just a very simple string, what do you call it? String concatenation is doing. Let's go take a look at the config and make sure that we haven't made any undo. So this could be what we're dealing with. This allows base URI to be understand project paths that are not in the root directory of the web space. This will break is moved, or possibly if the web server rewrite rules are changed. So I think this is assuming some kind of rewrite rule. I am going to, for sake of argument, remove this and see if that has a positive effect. Node property. Okay, so we need to put this in, but we're not going to pre-reg replace. We're just going to go ahead and say this. So we'll do this. Come on, fat arrow. Let's see if that's enough. Assumed base URI is app config. Okay. So we're going to do app path. Yeah, app path. It's interesting. Oh, base path, base path. Oh, yeah, right, probably missing some silly characters. It's not matching anymore. Okay, let's see what we get here. Ooh, that is really weird. We have tutorial jammed in there. It's giving me an absolute path now. Let's go take a gander and see. So we're going to set base. Oh, that makes sense. Instead of some kind of crazy regex thing, we're just going to set it to root. Do. Yup. Should be as simple as this. And then we'll go see how this variable is being used by the rest of the application. Okay. So we don't want the base path. Now we're losing the base application portion of it. So let's go see where base URI is getting registered. Is application base URI. Okay. It's interesting that it does not have the domain attached to it. Anyways, this is the DI setup that we've been provided for in the tutorial, where we will use /tutorial as our entry point, or as our alias for the root path. And when we change this in config, this will set it equal to the base, which I guess maybe the point is it needs to be, not according to this, it doesn't need to be anything special. Let's get this sign up, that slash out of there, just to make sure I'm now not making a big fuss over nothing. There we go. All right, we're back on board. Now, of course, we don't have a handler, but so an interesting thing to note is that if you do provide like an absolute path, this actually knocks out the whole domain and the rest of that abstraction. So we are always going to assume that these start with domain / and then moving forward. So of course I have Nicholas from the project. He's sitting in Discord chatting with me as well. So of course, if you're watching, you should come in and listen to him try to um, try to side seat drive with a 30-second delay. So that's a challenge for him. And usually I'm about approaching the solution, and he'll post it, and he acts as effectively my live confirmation that I have some idea how to resolve a problem, which is very lovely. So, like, a nice, since we're taking a short break, because I'm going to have to edit out this part of the recording, big shout out to Nicholas, who is pretty awesome, I have to admit. So if you get a chance to meet him or talk to him, you are a lucky person. All right, so let's get back into this. Enstein. I need a clapper. So let's see. I'll probably have to re-record. Let's start with that. Let's start with that because I'll splice that one in when we're doing the config portion. Yeah. So we'll do this. So we'll go ahead back to what's there, and then we'll cut in and see how it goes. So one of the important things that I've realized, the way that the standard project builds the base URL is a little bit different than the tutorial. And so for simplicity's sake, so we don't get ourselves in any kind of little oddities dealing with the URL rewrite kind of rules, we're going to simplify this base URL and make it look like what's in the documentation. So during our DI container setup, we want to make sure that we set the base URI of the application. I do believe that if we just didn't bother doing this, it would be naturally set to root. Because the project template does try to set up a lot of this stuff for you, we are going to simplify that by just setting it manually ourselves. So I'm going to start by remarking out this line and replacing it with this, which seems super simple, but it has a dramatic change in the way that this thing is able to build URLs when you use a tag operations like link to. Now, just so we can walk the path of this configuration. So URL is a DI service, and we are going to go look at services, and here is where we've configured it, and it looks very, very similar to what's in the tutorial, with the difference of that we're pulling that value from the config object instead of kind of like figuring it out, or like entering it right here. We also are providing a URL resolver, which is probably able to execute some additional information based on this, but we can delve into that a little bit later. So, take a break. See what's going on over here. Get my composure. Wonder how many, let's see, dropping any packets today? Oh man. Doing pretty good, I have to admit. Okay. Back to our templates. So the tag tool is injected from DI. It's part of the factory default. It gives us a lot of helpful features, allowing us to build HTML tags without us having to necessarily write them ourselves or to exit the PHP block and then have to possibly reopen one. So depending on the use case, it has the added benefit of kind of like simplifying and being very descriptive to the product you're trying to build. In this case, we're just showing it as an opportunity for you to start seeing it more than once. Because you're going to have to, at some point on your own, make the decision of when you want to use the tag tools and when you want to write your own HTML. Of course, in the Volt world, the PHP block is inverted. So it's expected to be in an almost HTML syntax, and then there's a special notation for providing evaluatable blocks of PHP code, which will be then parsed kind of like then in reverse, where the text will be or everything will be wrapped in normal PHP tags. So we've designed our sign-up form. Let's go see what that thing looks like. And let's just check this URL. So we said the URL is signup. It took our base application or base domain, added our base path, which is /, and then added that signup. Now, in order for this to work, if we break down the route here, so obviously / is a alias for index, and if there's nothing after the /, that's an alias for the index action. In the case of this, so we have the / which is an alias for the index controller, and then we're going to resolve to the signup handler. If I click this, we'll find that signup handler cannot be loaded. And it's kind of a nice error message. It's telling me that it's either looking through signup controller or something of that nature to figure out how to resolve this particular problem. All right, so we are now going to... Oh, and we should probably just take a look at what the rendered HTML looks like. So let's bring up a view page source. Not the prettiest thing. We'll use DevTools. Come on, there you go. So as we see, create a regular anchor tag. We expected that. And if you've ever used a framework that has a tag library, this is something that should feel very natural to you. So next step, we've rendered the page, we know that it works, we want to add the signup controller so that we can resolve this signup. Okay. So we're going to create a new controller. Now remember, we have to suffix any controller with controller, otherwise the system won't know how to dynamically handle the response to the correct service. Now at this point you may have said to me, hey, where is that? We didn't include that with Composer. So remember, Phalcon is a C extension. All of these classes have been expressed in the extension and then compiled to C. So even though we're using traditional PHP use statements, they are resolving to something that is compiled, which is really quite clever. Now PHP has always had this functionality. The problem is that it was, if you think of the language that PHP is, and which part of society, of the development community it has impacted, it's definitely not the people who spend time learning C, right? It's web developers, it's people who make websites, right? Like, it's an abstraction for the purpose of, we need to build this thing, we need to build it relatively fast, and we want low overhead. So, one of the reasons that, for example, Zend has to stay around, right, is that in order for their framework to compete and be fast, and for the language to improve in general, a lot of really smart people have to write a lot of really smart C code. And that's kind of like the magic of Zephyr, or Zephyr, is it provides a way for the people who normally write PHP code to build something that also works as fast as the C extensions. And that's always been the project's goal. All right, so we now have something to resolve our signup URL. We've created a new action suffixed with the action, and we need to provide a template for it. We're going to continue to use PHTML. And this one I'm not going to type out, I'm just going to copy for sake of your ears. So we'll create a new folder. This one is going to be named what, right? It's going to be named for the controller that we're building. So it's going to be the signup folder, and in the signup we will then create an index PHP, So there's our empty file, and I will fill it with the information from our template. Now in this case, we are using a little bit of nested PHP. And we're using these tag libraries once again. They're going to build for us a form header, which we then can provide the action. It'll default to the standard method. And inside we can write our structural components to make our form look nice. And then anytime we want to put a form field in, we can use the text field or submit button. And in the most part, it does make the code look a bit cleaner. And the best part is that somewhere down the line, because these things are kind of static calls, they'll be compiled out, and we don't need to evaluate them every single call. So that's one of the strong benefits of Phalcon's caching layer, is that the first time this gets called, it'll be rendered, and then some of these things that are likely to not change, they'll stop being code, which is good for us. So let's go ahead and check what our form looks like. So once again, we're here. Now this resolves to the signup controller. So we can now send something. Let's take a look at what the HTML looks like for this. All right, here's what we got. We've got a form whose action is signup / register, which is what provided the tag. The default method is post. And then we have our two labels and fields, nicely nested in paragraph tags. Now, of course, we don't have anything to resolve the post action of this, but let's go ahead and fill it out. See what happens. Okay, so action register was not found on handler signup. So let's just demystify this. Signup is the controller, which is registered as the handler, and register is the action. So the signup controller does not have a register action. That's what this is telling us. So next step for us is we need to be able to save this information somewhere. But right before, let's go ahead and just stub out that reaction, or the register action from our controller, so we won't get that error anymore. It just won't do anything. Equally nice. Now we have two ways of creating a model here. We can create them by hand, or we could scaffold them with Phalcon tools. So Phalcon model will actually create the model for us. In the tutorial, we start by creating a SQL, which represents the DDL changes, which will happen to the database. And then we create a model for users, which represents the same fields. It's important that we actually create the fields for each table column that we create, so that there's a contract between the serialization and deserialization operations coming along from these models. These models, while they do extend I believe, doctrine as the underlying ORM, they're in their own right kind of a popo, you know. And so they should try to exist in a simple state. Now, if we use the scaffold tool, so let's go with Phalcon model, and this will tell us that we need to provide a table name and our options. Now, one of the things that we're probably going to have to do is set up our database adapter first in order to do this. So let's go ahead and set that up. So to have that configured, we're going to need a DB service. Now, as far as I am aware, the base application does provide a kind of like base constructor for a DB service. And all we have to do is then provide our credentials to the configuration object, and it'll just start working. So let's take a look here. So in this case, they're using MySQL. I would assume that there's a Postgres adapter as well. Let's load up something simple. So I don't use MAMP a lot, but because I don't do a lot of MySQL work, I find it very convenient in the dealing with servers part. So let's just verify our MySQL configuration. Let's see here. Here we go. So MySQL port is 3306, and I believe the username and password is something boring. I like to run my Apache port on port 80, which is why it always asks me. Yes. Looks like a very, very basic configuration. So this will keep us from having to work too hard. Of course, on a Mac, installing MySQL or Postgres is super easy, and outside that, in Windows, you're using XAMPP or whatever you would normally use to do this. So I like to take the least pain route when setting up a test project's database. It's so amazingly easy to lose half a day just trying to do basic configuration. So DB name is tutorial 1. Go ahead and save that. We should be able to make DB calls now. Now, we don't have that database created, so we should probably go into PHP MyAdmin or some other tool. My PHP MyAdmin doesn't work. Well, that's easy. So I don't really like PHP MyAdmin. The tool I prefer to use is MySQL Workbench. And while it is probably by and far not the best tool ever created, it is an extremely buggy platform. It does provide probably the most interesting tool set that you're going to get in all of so maybe outside of something fancy in the Oracle land. So we're going to create a new schema. So we'll call that tutorial 1. That way, when we start executing our scripts, we'll have something to connect to. All right, so there we got our tutorial 1 database. Now I'll keep this off to the side so we can go ahead and see what happens after we run our model command. Let's go ahead and Phalcon model, and then the table will be, I believe, we're going to call it the plural, would be the correct way to deal with this. Yep, it should be the plural, so it should be users. And I forgot. And then what's options? So we provide the name. We then need to provide, where do we add our columns? Or maybe this doesn't actually talk to the database yet. Maybe we'll make a migration for that one. I don't think I need any of these options. Table name, name of SCITA, models namespace, attributes will be protected and have a getter setter. I mean, that makes sense. Unless this is basing the model off of. Let's make a migration first. So Phalcon migration will generate and run a migration. We will provide it with, so we'll first do Phalcon migration generate. And No such file or directory. I disagree. Phalcon, migration, generate. Never my favorite. So it's creating like a folder with a version, but then not creating any file for it. All right, well I guess I won't be doing this, will I? Well, I know what's next on my list of things to fix. And now for my favorite part of open source development. Nope, over here. Is that the same error I'm getting? I'm getting a SQL state error, which makes me think that this is unable to talk to my database, maybe. Let's look at a little help. Not as helpful as I was hoping. Yeah, no such love. Yes, I'm calling generate, which should generate a migration, which it's trying to do, and then saying SQL state. So let's double check to make sure that I can actually connect to the database. Let's see here. Let's take a look. Oh, PDO, you're always such trouble. I don't need you or that one. Let's check here. So we'll make a new connection. And localhost, root, and my super secure password. And default schema will be tutorial1. The name is tutorial1 test. Test connection. Alright, so definitely supported connecting. Oh, hello. That's interesting. I wonder if I have two MySQL databases running. Nope. You always have to run concurrent versions of databases. Let's see. Says we're running. Says the port is 3306. Okay, but for some reason this won't let me connect. Let's try again. Oh, so now it does it. So it's letting me connect without a password. Yeah, okay. So for some reason, while MAP is telling me that it requires a database or a password, it appears to me that it doesn't. Let's see if this gives us anything different. No, still SQL state HY002002. Well, there's only one thing I can do, and that is to provide users. All right. So I'm going to connect instead from 127.0.0.1 because I like that one. We're going to use the name, oops, test. Let's go ahead and test this in my SQL Workbench and see what actually works. So I think instead I'm going to make a new user that requires a password because I have some strange curiosity that it's not saying what I want. So tutorial 1, password is root, confirm password is, I know it's weak password, but it's your default password. Yep, I need to escalate my permissions. Tutorial 1. And we'll just give that user all the privileges. So I think the error is that a database, when password is an empty string, it actually sends an empty string. It does not send null. Delete subfolders. You are giving me a hard time, computer. Okay. So Phalcon will generate a migration from a table to migrate. So let's just create nothing to, you should create tables first. So I don't get an error. Show tables from tutorial. Okay. Not what I expected. And let's see here. So what else would we have? Well, since now I'm connecting to the database, we might as well see what happens when I do Phalcon model users. Error table users doesn't exist. So no matter what we do, our migrations are reverse engineered from the table schema, or we can make them by hand ourselves. Let's just go ahead and update our table, which for our case means that we can use the existing schema provided. I don't even need this window. There we go. So we're going to create the table first, and then we'll be able to use tools to help us, the dev tools, to help us build the inferred table. So I'm going to use the SQL that's here so I don't have to write my own. Now on my SQL workbench, for example, you just need to default the schema, and then we should be able to execute this script. That created the table. We'll do a quick refresh. And now we have our users table. Oh, not what I wanted. ID, name, and email, just like we built. All right, so let's now generate our migration from this. Which creates a migration in reverse. We could have created this ourselves by hand. The purpose of migrations, of course, is to allow for you to be able to replicate database state, like your DDL state, as it morphs over time, which is guaranteed going to happen. So now that we have this, the next time someone wants to come along and set up their project, they will not have to create the table first. They should be able to so theoretically, in the configuration, we should be able to make a tutorial 2 and then do rake db, or not rake, in my Rails world, Phalcon migration run, and it should walk these in order, affecting the configured database with these changes. Super duper, like almost completely essential to the structure of your application. We also have that table, which means we can also have this thing generate a migration for it. Not our migration, but the model for us, which will then end up looking like this. So, Phalcon model, and we will give the table name, users, which will then take a look at the database, and we go into the models directory, and here is our users.php. Now, not only does it provide us with a very basic model with our public identifiers, which then can serialize to the table, it even provides us the constraint information that was generated. So, for example, neither one of these fields are nullable. It says exactly what their type is, their expected length as configured by the database, and then other annotation-like calls. And then provides a validation layer, since the to simplify when we actually get down to writing forms, that we can provide the correct email. And this appears that it's just keying off the fact that the column was named email, and it was smart enough to realize that emails would require the email validator. provides us a initialize so that we can figure out what schema and what the table name is for this model. These are not required. They are optional in case you needed to wire a model to a different, if they weren't identity, they weren't mapped one-to-one. And then provide us an alias for find first so that we can make those calls more easily against this model. Some of these things could probably be moved into a parent class, but this is the generation structure for creating models as it stands from DevTools. We'll see though that the very core portion is exactly what we'd expect. ID, name, and email fields. And those are what we're going to use. So we're doing it slightly out of order. We obviously had to set up our database connection first, create our tables, and then generate our models and other pieces from that. So we're going to move on to storing data using models. So now in the register action, which is the result, the post action as a result of submitting our form, we want to actually save that user information somewhere. So here's our signup controller, here's our register action. Now here's the most important part. Users is a popo, which means we can just instantiate it and then affect its properties, provide it individual construction. We can customize it any way that we want to use it in our application. So an individual user is a new users. So we're going to call the save method on the user object, and then we're going to pass it some properties, which should be in the request that the server received. We're going to store as a Boolean the response, whether it was successful or not, and that's how we're going to decide how to respond to the user later. So I'm going to copy this portion in, since it's got lots of tabs. So this request is available in the scope of the controller, and then we can get the post object. Now, this does mean that if someone had made a get request against this action, we would have nothing to extract, and we wouldn't, there would be no post object, it would be an empty associative array. So we're going to extract these values from the post object, and then we're going to interrogate whether this was successful or not. Now in this case, because we're using PHTML, I don't believe that these echoes will show up. I think, well, they might. We'll see what happens. So then we're in the process of, what happens in the success or failure mode of our particular request. So yes, I was successfully able to save that data, which means I didn't violate any of the constraints of that model. I will then say messages equals user get messages. And to make sure that we don't encounter the view, which is actually the thing I was initially concerned about, if we call to view to disable itself at the end, we will only see the things in this file. So let's go ahead and see what this would look like if we did a GET request. So obviously our action is register. And got to start up that server. make sure I got the right path. Pretty sure it's supposed to be register. Yep, sign up / register. So, for some reason it made the background body black. And I don't see a style that's necessarily implying that. But as we can see the messages on the page, email is required, and sorry, the following names required. And so each one of these names required, email is required. These are the messages coming back from user, which were the errors that occurred when trying to save. So now messages was populated automatically as the this event happened. So we hit save, and then inside the scope of this call to this action for this response, messages was populated with, kept getting pushed into with messages as they happened. So that's where we have this for each bit. Now we could have sent these as flash notifications as well, but that's a step for a different day. I'll have to figure out why. Yeah, so this view disable turns screen black. So let's just leave that out. Sorry, the following problems were generated. Names required, emails required. And of course, we could pretty this up a little bit. But now, in order for us to actually save this data, we would have to make this request as a post action. So let's register. That returns the success message of thanks for registering. Now, what's more important was the data actually saved. Well, let's go find out. The answer is yes. Very, very easily yes. Let's go ahead and do it all again and just make sure that, so it will be Paul 2, and this will be Paul at SavvySoftworks. It's a different email address. Yep, everything looks good. And refresh, and there's our 2 users. And that's really it for this tutorial. Now, we're going to probably make some revisions to it, it seems, unfortunately. But the core work seems to be fine, thankfully. All right, so I've been recording this for an hour and a half. That took longer than I expected, and I even cut out a lot of the bits. I only had 2 problems, so I could probably cut this down to 40 minutes, but I need to find a shorter version of this. Well, I think that practice makes perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the whole thing again. And this time, This time we're going to do it the straight-laced way and see if we get the same effect. Easy enough. Easy enough. That's a good thing to try. I did say I was going to do both. Go ahead and stop this. And we'll put that over here and start, let's see here, start exporting that. It's going to be a pretty big file, to be honest. So that's tutorial with DevTools. I'm going to dump this somewhere else. Like To external drive. Got 300 gig on this drive. That should be perfect. There we go. All right, so let's start over. Let's go ahead and delete everything. That's gonna take about 22 minutes. Let's go ahead and get rid of drop schema. Yep, drop now. Let's go ahead and get this out of the way. Let's go ahead and clear this out. Let's go ahead and rename this to tutorial 1 dev tools. And then we'll just close all this. And we will remove folder from project and close this file. All good. Okay. So now we're going to start over again. This will be fun. Alright, so here is a fresh buffer. Really, I just want a new window. Nope, wrong thing. There we go. New empty buffer. All right, so we'll be able to create a tutorial 1 again. Okay. Whew. Did I miss any questions in the middle there? No? No one cares? No one cares? All right, all good. Someone's watching, so hi to whoever that is. Appreciate your patience. This is all fun challenge for me, making videos and generally troubleshooting how things work. Still kind of impressed I haven't dropped any frames, and I'm going at what, 10,000 kilobits a second stream? This is pretty cool. Okay. Alright, quick time. Let's get a new one. Oh, you're already running. New screen recording. Pick the right, yep, got that. Hit record, pick our screen. Hey everyone, this is Paul, and we're going to go through the Phalcon dev tools. Just restart, just whatever. These are the kind of days you need a beer. But no beer, just water. Just delicious water. All right, one more time. Oh, I'm gonna drink some hot tea later. That's for sure. Very exciting. Let's see here. New screen recording. I apologize for anyone who got caught listening to that. Hey everybody, this is Paul, and we're going to go through the first Phalcon tutorial. You can find that at docs.phalcon.com, and then on the left-hand side there is a section called Getting Started, and I'm sorry, below Getting Started, it's tutorials, and we're going to do the basic one. So to start this one off, we need to identify a specific file structure. Now, Phalcon in its own right is designed to be extremely modular, so that really we don't have to follow any particular file structure, and we can adapt Phalcon to our needs. That said, we generally work with others, And that means that we need to be able to have some consistency in our projects so that we can kind of know what to expect and know where things live when we start working together. So we have kind of a standard pattern that our projects go under. This is very similar to it. It's a overly simplified variant. If you use DevTools, it'll create a project which has significantly more folders and kind of like layers to it, but it effectively follows the same components. The components would be the app, which is where our source code is stored, our controllers, our models, our templates and views, and our library, and some of our configuration can live in there. The library being any additional code that you need that's separate. So in the sense of if we were doing very solid and service-based, your library would probably be full of services and components. Then we also have the public portion. So everything that lives within the app directory should probably be code. And almost everything that lives in public should be static assets. Now, it doesn't stop them from being code, because of course we have our JavaScript in there. But images, CSS, all that stuff should live in there. And that's so that when we set up our rewrite rules on our web server, we don't try to make Phalcon route to those static files. It really just wastes worker time. Now, also in that public folder is our bootstrap file. So that is the one entry point, that one executable file that'll live there. So we're going to start by building this. So I'm going to make a directory called tutorial1. And then I'm going to open up that in Sublime Text. So I have this subble command. So subble dot for me will, I think I went one directory up too high. We'll try that again. Got to go into the folder and then subble that folder. There we go. So here's our project. And I went into the wrong folder again. Ugh, doing a good job of this. Tutorial 1. There we go. So that project is empty. We need to create an app folder, and then we need to create a public folder. So within the app folder, we're going to need controllers, models, and views. I have apparently a little click crazy. There we go. New folder. So the controllers folder will store the handlers for the URL routes that we will provide to the application. They all get handled through the entry point index.php, but once it figures out what it is, it uses pattern matching to resolve which controller handler and then which action should actually finish the resolution of a request. Models, of course, are where the plain old PHP object representation of a table in the database. That said, they don't necessarily have to be table information. It is possible for models to be ephemeral, but for simplicity and for kind of like consistency, we try to make sure that anything we describe as a model is a data model, and that model is persistable, meaning that it can be saved somewhere and then it'll be serialized and deserialized as needed. Views are the front-end version of the content that we deliver to the client, and the client being the browser. So what we put in our views is effectively the HTML and dynamic PHP content that makes our application dynamic, like makes it an application and not a website. In our public directory, I'm not going to bother making CSS images or JS because we're not going to touch them. But I am going to create the index.php file, because we will need that. And then for the sake of our ability to use the Phalcon DevTools server, which is what I'm going to use for testing, I will need to also add a .phalcon folder, which is required. And I'm going to then also need to make a htrouter file. The htrouter is just something that it enables the PHP local server to run my Phalcon project without me having to set up Apache or Nginx or anything like that. So the content of that file is not in the tutorial per se. It is, let's see here. I have a link though for it that you can go to get the real one, which looks like this. And all this really does is just check to see if the file exists in the public directory. If it does, it just serves it. It's kind of like a code-based version of HT, or the URL rewrite that Apache or Nginx would do. That's super common. And for sake of naming convention, I make this a dot file. So with those two things, I can now run Phalcon serve, which is just my simple way of not having to have too many dependencies to run my application. Or really configure servers, which is not what I want to be doing when I'm developing. Of course, your opinion on that can differ, and you can set up your project any way you like. Well, I actually think you should set it up consistently, but you can run it any way you like. And those instructions all exist in the tutorial, and as part of the installation, also give you details on how to properly set up each one of those services. Okay, back to the tutorial. So we've got our folder set up. Now we need to finish our bootstrap. Now in the bootstrap, which is the index.php, also might be known as the entry point of the application, since all requests executed against PHP will enter your application through this one file. We're going to register our component autoloaders, and that's part of how our DI container knows which things should be injected into. And then we also will configure our services. The services are the entities which will be injected into our containers. And then we provide the final step, which is just resolving the request. So the first thing we're going to need is a loader. Now loaders follow PSR4 requirements, except unlike, say, Composer, which uses a PHP-based autoloader, the autoloader for Phalcon is actually baked into the extension. So it's a native runtime going and reading and accessing your files, which is going to be significantly faster. There's nothing wrong with what Composer is doing, but for the sake of making sure that performance is always on the top level when it comes to your Phalcon project, that autoloader was built into the extension. So that means that the first thing we're going to do is create this file and then also use the loader. So loader is not a PHP file. It is compiled into the extension. We are accessing it in memory during runtime, and so effectively it's written in C. But we access it just like we'd access any other PHP namespace. So we instantiate the loader, and then we're going to call a couple of registration actions on it. Namely, we're going to register directories. Oops. Now, register directories takes an array of locations where files that should be autoloaded live. So for us, the files we care about for this project, which is effectively going to create a user registration app, are the models and the controllers. So this will now, anytime we make a request for a new file, or we try to resolve an action, which it will then try to infer from the result, the class and object that needs to be instantiated, it will use those two locations as its search path. And that's really what registering is doing with the loader, is we're appending search path so that we can figure out where our files live. So it's something you don't necessarily want to abuse. So now it's because of these kind of calls that we say that Phalcon is so loosely coupled, even to its structure. I could call these things whatever I want. You know, other frameworks, this is not a dig on them, but other frameworks are very bound, and some of that is based on the language and how that language executes, as to the location of certain resources. And they can probably be configured, but that configuration has been hidden. Uh, in the case of Phalcon, we want to be able to, since it's a PHP extension, we want to make it so that, say you need to bake Phalcon into part of another application, it should be absolutely doable, right? By registering the right directories and doing the right work, you could layer them together. We're not recommending that you do that, but speed and modularity are always the top priorities. So we've registered our files that need to be autoloaded, and now we're going to start dealing with the dependencies, the services with which we're going to inject in the containers that those will load. So we need to now add a new dependency, which will be the factory default from DI, and DI stands for dependency injection. Now, factory default is just a special class which automatically instantiates most of the common containers for our dependency injection. Sorry, services for our dependency injection. Factory. Huh. So it's great for bootstrapping your app when you're just starting out, but it does obviously add things that you don't necessarily know you need, and so it's possible that when you're ready to release your application, you might actually get to the point where it's important to maybe go back through and then manually just add individual dependencies as needed. But to simplify our efforts here, we're just going to use the factory default, which we add those containers by just instantiating a new instance of factory default. The next thing we need to do is we need to worry about how views are handled. So we registered directories for apps and for controllers and models, but we didn't touch views. Now, views are their own special thing, which is the end of the resolution chain. So in this case, we have a DI container. We're going to now add something to the DI container. We're going to add the view. Now, the string portion of the dependency injection is actually the name of how we want to access it. Like, we can get that thing back. It's not so important what we call it. It's what we establish behind it that matters. Now, for view, because other portions of the system are going to require view to be present in order to execute, because it's going to do that, like it's going to be configured that way automatically, we're going to want to make sure we name this one correctly. But for your own dependencies, you might have more than one variation of a configured dependency. For example, let's say that you have an external service we have a service which actually talks to an external server, makes API requests. But for testing purposes, you want to produce a API compliant mock version. Well, by naming them differently, you are able to decide that during test time you will load a different container to be injected. Right? You can make some additional decisions around how that service is being delivered to the rest of your application. So at the end of every call to a specific, to instantiate a service, we just need to return that an instance of that object, and we can call set or set shared. Set would return us we'll call this function every single time, I think at least once per container invocation, when we need to access something, whereas set shared should create it as a single shared instance, kind of like a singleton. So in this case, we're saying where do we want this thing to live, and then we're going to return the instance of the view service. And that's it. Now, the final step is to provide the base URI for the request resolution. So there's a lot of magic that's happening when you pass a URL to this. It's going to walk everything past the domain to figure out which controller and which controller acts and which handler, and then which function on that handler we're going to call to handle it. So to help the system figure out which where the flow starts, we set the base URI, which has more than just an impact on path resolution. It also helps with a lot of the tag helper work, which we'll see when we build our form. And I have forgotten to name it. And this whole thing needs to be in a function. I have just hard to talk and type. There we go. They all kind of look the same. All right, quick parse of that. All right, so now the final step is we just have to launch the application. Now this is also useful to understand this process when you're dealing with test rating, because you also need an instance of the application in order to have access to the DI container so that you can run your tests. You can have a separate application container for your tests, for example. That's another way of delivering like mock services versus real services. But it kind of works the same way, where we're going to have to create a DI and then also have a application with which to handle. So the application receives the DI container, which you'll notice is not like, say, the way DI works in Java, where there's some clever type checking and name resolution, which helps it figure out which of its dependencies need to be instantiated when they're auto-wired, when they're injected, like with Spring. PHP doesn't have strong typing, and therefore the injection is a little less specific. So basically things that need the DI container that are part of the application registration will get access to their local scope. Any of the functions, any of the DI that we set in our DI container. So kind of everything gets everything. And that's not necessarily a dig on PHP or a benefit of Java. It's just something that's the way that it works for the way that that language works. We would probably waste a lot of effort trying to do magic resolution so that only the right bits get built. And we might find that as a good solution for later. But the best way to think about it is just the bag that you have access to. And as you add things, you'll have them available to you in that scope. So this last spec, we made an application, we gave it the DI container we've defined, and then we said, I would like you to handle the request and return the response, and then I want to send the response out. Now that is enough to run the application, and yet it won't do anything. So let's just see what happens when we run at this point. Now Phalcon serve is just a utility as part of Phalcon DevTools, which will look for the HT router file I mentioned. It will set the document root as public, and then expose that on 8000. So we should probably get an error when we go here, because there won't be anything to handle index. And we get something like, well, as you can see there, we get something like this. Uncaught exception that could not call index controller, because of course we haven't done all the work. So let's go ahead and continue on. And one of the things that is kind of like idiomatic to do is to actually handle exceptions that occur here by wrapping the final response in a try. Now, there's a good and a bad side to this by doing this. Obviously, tries can invoke any code twice. So by putting a try here, while you are providing a healthy way of tracking exceptions, any exception will actually execute your code up to twice. And so since we just threw an exception, it would be nice to see how this pattern changes what we'd see on screen. And I've got the typo. I think I forgot. There we go. So by providing this, we get a more concise error that the index handler class cannot be loaded, but maybe not necessarily at the risk of the performance. So this is a decision you want to make. This is a very appropriate tool for development, but it might not be something we want to run on the production server. Now, thankfully, all the DI setup won't be done twice, only the actual resolution portion. But as your application grows, you will find that you will be generating a significant amount of that. So up next, we're going to create the controller. So the naming convention is things that have been required, if it has the suffix controller, will be registered as handlers, with the prefix being which portion of the application is handling. Now, index is special. So index will get special responsibility as handling anything with the slash on it. And then we also have actions. So the suffix action is how we resolve which function based on the text that's passed in the route, in the URL. In the case of index, again, it's a special case. So index is the root controller, and then the index action is when there is nothing past that. So it's just a slash or canonically nothing. So now this will allow us to create this class object, which will return this echo hello when we request it. And so we've still got our server running, so we should now be able to test this again and see what happens. Do we have, still says index controller. Did I name something wrong? Probably. Controllers, index controller. It seems to like that with index action. I probably have to rerun my server. Nope. Just doesn't like it. Okay, so we got a typo here. Controllers. The index controller class cannot be loaded. Alright, so let's make sure we spelled everything right. Controllers. Sounds good. We have a base URL that's set up. We have our view folder set up. Now we don't have any views, but that's okay. Let's see here. What are we missing? Control. Oh, Incidentally, we do not have a base controller, and that is what this is complaining about. I mean, oh no, never mind. We're just requiring right from Phalcon MVC controller. Well, I would like to see a better error. And in some cases, that's the result of removing this try block. So it definitely has to be something that I've spelled wrong. It seems like there's nothing syntactically wrong with the class. It just says it can't be loaded. Well, let's go make sure that I didn't misspell something here. Extra slash. No, that's not what it was said about at all. Thought it was. It makes sense to me that it would be. So we're definitely getting to the handle step. So it's not something that's necessarily happening in this file, per se. Although it absolutely could be something that is misconfigured in this file. Let us see here. What tiny nagging mistake have I done? We've loaded it. We've got our models. We've got our index controller. Under controllers, it's called index controller. We have a function called index action and echoes something. And yet, you were happy to tell me that index controller handler class could not be loaded. It's one of those things that as soon as I see it, I'm going to be pretty mad about it. Okay, it's definitely not that. Well, let's go ahead and look at this again. So it does actually do it does actually recommend that we put these slashes at the end. Oops, wrong window. I did have this happen before. Nope. Okay, so it's not something dealing with the view resolution at the end of the chain. It has strictly to do with the fact that it just can't find this controller no matter what it tries. Well, let's try something for an example. Let's just make a new controller. Okay, so we'll have a public function action. So it'll be test action. And then we're going to echo the same thing, because I don't think there's anything wrong with what we're trying to echo. And so let's see what happens when we resolve that, because this is what we're getting now. So test should say test controller cannot be loaded. That's cool. And then we say action. And it still says test controller cannot be loaded. So it doesn't seem like it matters what we're doing. We're not resolving to any of our controllers. It's a not you, it's me kind of situation. I keep wanting to say that it's like this that's spelled wrong. Controllers, they're trolling you all the time. Always trolled by the controllers. Let's make sure that we're not missing anything from our bootstrap file that might be just a nagging error. So we did loader, register, directories, add our directories as an array. We then say loader register. We created our factory default. We it's interesting. Well, it's worthwhile for me to go stare at a different project and just make sure that there's not something finicky going on here. All right. Makes sense. I'm more than happy to do this though. Makes it a smaller bit of change. Do it all in one line. So the only thing that I can see different is that in this project we initiated the factory first and then did loader last. And if there is some kind of order dependence to that, but it shouldn't be. App controllers. Whew, I need a break. I'm tired. Yeah, so we're not dependent on order, none of that matters. And The directories look correct. I don't think we have any file permission problems. Our class names should match our files, which they do. So the next thing. The other project I was working on has a base controller for some of that sharing of behavior between controllers, but it's just effectively empty, and they just extend that instead of controller directly. But that doesn't have any real effect here as to what's different. So I can only think that base path and so current directory should be public. And that means app path should just be /app/ something or other. Let's find out. Let's see if we're just naming this wrong. That something has changed. Okay, let's go into tutorial 1. So that means that if this current directory is where we're executing it from, it would be because of the HT router. Yeah, that's all it is. So because we're executing from here, technically, and then calling inside, we should probably start getting into the habit of actually moving the router inside of the public directory so it actually lives in this. And that's actually a proposal I've been making, is that if we're going to continue to use the router, it should be part of the index PHP. And so that would be reconfigured this way. We wouldn't have to require once. We would, yeah, it'd just be this. It'd be really, really easy. So that would be step 1, is that the router just lives inside of the application. Apologies, I just bumped the microphone. And if it is a file that it finds in this current directory /public, so we don't need this anymore, it's just /public, just public. Actually, it's just this. That passes. Otherwise, we just go ahead and finish doing the rest of the application. It would mean that this would mutate slightly. That's if we want to maintain that this is ... of course. And this is kind of a soft spot in how we deal with, local development servers, because it's moving around which directory is the entry point. So Phalcon serve is configurable. We would want to then say base path is index.php, which will still, well, it's not just that, it's public index.php. So we're saying the router exists here as well. And so now you'll see that the controller works. I'm probably gonna have to go back to this whole thing over again. It's so difficult. Boy, documentation is super hard, but I'm gonna get it right. So I've got these recordings, just to circle around. I got all these recordings now, and what they let me do is they let me go back and see where the failures are. So each time I do this, it's gonna get better. It's gonna get faster. So maybe I'm not gonna get anything done today after all, but I'm definitely gonna suss out all the nuance. And so if anyone back there watching, like, enjoy. I'm gonna find your problems by force, and I'm gonna fix them. All right, let's continue from here. So obviously, the reason that these two, the router and the index, were separated had to do with execution order. There's actually a super simple way to identify if you're running through the PHP server. And I'm going to look that up right now. So, since the built-in PHP server does things a little bit differently, it uses the PHP SAPI, the serial API, and you can do this. Anytime you're using it. Yeah, that's what I want. And what this does is it says, hey, if I'm using the CLI server, which is the internal one, then go ahead and run this router. And so what I could probably do is actually put the router where I left it, and then just require it. So in this case, I was requiring once. I won't do that anymore. This is probably a better overall solution. And so I want to do the executing directory, which is index.php, and then I want to do /htrouter. And now that should have the same effect, except I now don't have to worry about, let's see, failed to open stream, couldn't find public / .. Okay, not perfect. We're getting there though. So ultimately, we can definitely say that this worked. Die. Hello. Yep. So we definitely know that this part is working on this particular server. If I was to configure this with MySQL, it would be a completely different story. All right, so we're entering here, requiring once the htrouter, which, let's see if this works. It's first going to URL decode this, and then I guess I probably need to change this path once again, since now I'm local to the public directory. Let's see if it likes that a little bit more. Okay. So it should be setting the get URL, and let's check to see that that is happening correctly. In that case, it's just telling us the URL is / in this event. So everything looks like it's working correctly. So it's still saying that it can't find our directories. Well, so now at this point, we should just double check to see where our directory is, just so that we're not making some mistakes here. So currently we're executing out of public. So probably now is the issue is that public does not have a trailing /. So our new route needs to look like that. So it's still not finding them. Let's go ahead and just restart this and make sure that I don't. Yeah, so now I've got a different naming problem. So public up one, and then into HT router. We load that. We know that that's running. We know that that's properly changed. Well, yeah, it should be properly changing something. What way can we verify that? Well, this needs to have a dot / in front of it, since this directory won't have that. If URI is not equal to /, then it should return false. And yeah, okay, very cool. Any other weirdness? Doesn't seem like it. So we'll put a die statement in here, and we'll just die the URI to see what's coming through. And that also should be /, which it is. And we also know it's not returning false because we're executing to this point. So this whole file is being resolved as we expect. So the next thing we need to debug is what's happening here. And for sake of our argument, we should be able to execute that file path, which we absolutely are. So the absolute path to our router is correct. It is executing, and now we're just getting a problem where these paths are not being registered correctly. So part of the way I think I want to avoid this problem is by just constructing them in a more sane way with an absolute path. This helps me avoid whether any of the, I mean, that magic variable directory is almost free, so I feel it's safe to use it. And to be honest, this is the thing I'm picking up from using the scaffolded project, is that having absolute paths to things really makes sense. I also like inverting this process for our router. Now, had we configured with directory in the first place and not bothered, it wouldn't have mattered whether we're running HT router or not, from whatever its location is, because this path would not be stuck in this relative world. It'd be an absolutely pathed one. All right, so let's continue. We got our index controller running. It is exporting hello. Next step is for us to look into how to externalize this template. We don't really want to spend a lot of time writing HTML inside of our controller. Our controller is supposed to orchestrate the data from the models, which is from the database, and then send it forward and make it available so that the view can display it in some kind of consistent manner. That means in the base, in the very core, the controller is also supposed to make some decisions as to like what template should be shown for what logical step. You don't want to put a lot of branching logic in your views, maybe with the exception of branching partials, just because that can get hairy real fast. So let's create a view. To make a view match towards the same controller you want, it's all about this naming convention. So we were able to resolve the route to the index action because we used /, which is special, and that says, oh, I need the index handler and then the index function on that handler. And views are very similar. So we're going to go to a new folder, and that new folder is going to be index. And then in there, we're going to make our template the same as the action. So the folder is the same as controller, and then the file is the same as the action. Now, we haven't registered any kind of special view handlers for processing our templates, so we're going to use plain old PHTML. And what that means is that the same thing we wrote in the controller can now be written in the file. And we're going to change this ever so slightly just so that we know that it changed, right? It's nice to know things. And we got nothing. Of course we did. So the index controller index action index.phtml. All right, so now it's because we don't have the path to our views set up correctly. So we need to follow the same pattern of adding this directory magic keyword. And now we have the correct view. Now, we can put PHP in here, we can put regular HTML in here. So if I want to put some additional HTML in, this is just like any file as you expect. With PHTML, you could effectively convert existing views from other frameworks and have them work as you expect right here in Phalcon, just the same. In fact, PHTML is kind of like the intermediate between other templating engines and the cache. The cache allows certain static things to be persisted so that when further requests are made against those actions, they will not need to be re-rendered from like a template language into effectively a PHP file. So PHTML is just one step higher than a .php file. So let's see, we didn't provide anything here, and that is exactly why it automatically went to go look for something. Now, we can technically echo in both places. And this should aggregate the request, but that should be limited only to the templates. Now, if we want to bypass this, though, we can say return something like this, and that will replace the contents and it won't ever get to the template rendering section. Okay, so we have our index controller, and what we want to put on our index controller is a sign-up form. So we're going to replace this with from the tutorial. Now, what's important here is that we're going to use this tag. This is part of factory, the DI factory. Tag is a service that gives us access to a bunch of aliases for certain HTML, which allows to create HTML tags in place. This is a very trivial example. There is a greater use for this when dealing with form classes and validation, which heavily utilize this structure to have consistent and performant HTML generation. All Link to, for example, does is create an anchor. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. So we've just changed this view and we saved it. And so we are URL provider is missing something. So we know we registered the URL provider, but let's see what the error says. So enter the engine renderer index true null. All right, and it's saying that our problem is on index PHP line 35. Let's go take a look and see what it's upset about. So we have created a URL and we have created a URL provider. So barring some typo, forgetting to wrap it in a function, maybe, no? It's okay. URL base URI, yep, and then we returned that URL object. Let's just go ahead and replace it, just in case there is a typo in there. I don't think there was. The tutorial has us create these at the /tutorial/location. Of course, I'm not terribly interested in that. I think it adds some cruft. So let's see here. Uncaught class. So probably what it is that we forgot to include our URL provider, though. That's what we forgot. So now we provide our URL provider. Here's our link, and you notice it just takes the current URL and then adds sign up to it. We click on it. Oh no, another class we don't have. Well, let's go ahead and make that. This one will be much easier now that we've got our naming convention all sorted out. Okay. So our next controller is called the sign up controller, and that's going to handle things that are /signup for us. Whoop, I don't want to save that. Okay, that's really going to look very similar to this class. So we're going to copy it and we're going to make some fundamental changes. Now we're not really going to use the index action per se. Well, we are. That's right. We're going to put our form here. We're not going to provide anything here. We're going to then create a new view for signup. So signup controller means signup folder in views. And then within there, the name of the action, index.phtml. And there we go. We've got all the pieces we need, and now all we need is the form. So you notice in this form, we're using tag an awful lot. And where we're using tag is where it kind of makes sense for things that we might track and validate. For example, like text field, submit button, and also just to simplify creating a simple form right away. So that's kind of easy and in our pocket. Let's go see and make sure that works. So the previous page had a link, sign up here, and we'll go to /signup and deliver that form to us. And we can see that if we look at the HTML, like it created a form, passing it to the action we gave it, sign up register. And then it sets the method to be post. So what happens when we fill it out? Well, we're missing the register action. That submit button is for register, and that is going to then ask for the register action. Right here, sign up /register. So we're going to have to create that action next. So these actions are pretty easy, right? So we can just simply copy this empty one and rename it. Now, in this particular instance, we're going to be posting to this action now. Actions in Phalcon are agnostic to their verb. So you can both get or post to the same handler and action. And that can provide a certain amount of trouble, being able to split up your routes. There, you would either want to deal with testing, if it's a post, and then doing something, but ultimately, with any of your actions that are postable, you're going to have to provide some kind of qualifier to deal with the response if it happens to be a get. Just the same. I mean, you don't have to, but you're going to not want to deliver errors. So this is more of a high-level concern when you're dealing with API design. But just be aware that just like any other PHP file, it both receives post or get, and it's the server headers that really change in how it accepts its data. So we have somewhere to set this. We are going to create a table in our database. Now, I use MySQL for this project, and so we have MySQL Workbench is what I use for most of my administration. We're going to create a users table, and so I need a database to put it in. So I'm going to create this schema. I'm going to call it tutorial 1. And in there, we're then going to create a users table. So in MySQL Workbench, if you double-click, it set as default. Or I double-click it, it'll set as the current selected schema. And then I have this query prepared, which will create an ID, name, and email field in a table. So we'll execute that, do a quick refresh. and we'll see that we now have our users table. All right, so now that we have that, we're going to need to make an associated model to represent the deserialized version of the PDO object requested from that table, right? That was a mouthful. So when we ask for and save things through doctrine, we're going to need to then put them in a way that we can programmatically access them. And so a model should represent the table as a minimum, and then you should be able to expand the model with certain programmatic functionality about how data should be handled for it. So here's our users model, and as we see, it's an ID, name, and email as our public fields. Now, I'm sure this one will auto-load, so we're good. But we will have to configure Phalcon to have access to a database. So here inside of our Bootstrap, we'll need to add a DB provider. So we're going to need to add the PDO MySQL adapter, since we're using MySQL. And then we're going to have to add that DB to our DI. So for this, I think my user is tutorial1, and I think I have a super secret password, and the database name is tutorial1. All right, that should work. And localhost, all good. So the next step is to see, we'll find out if we've actually configured this correctly when we try to sign up a user. So let's go ahead and add in the logic for the sign-up controller's registration action. So the first step is we're going to save this into a user. So we're going to need a user object in order to mutate. So we create an instance of users, and then we're going to worry about saving that. So the user object inherits a save function, I think. So make sure, yes, we want to make sure that we extended model. And that's where that save function came from. And then we're going to pass in from the post object, selecting individual fields from it that we will set against the that model. And then this will save it, persist it to the database. Now we're tracking whether it's successful because we want to be able to provide the user some feedback given there was any screw-ups, like we can't talk to the database, or we didn't provide the right fields. So there's some little magic that happens here. So we're going to go ahead and echo thanks for registering if it was successful. We don't have a view for sign-up registration, so this is just going to be echoed as right to the buffer, the response buffer. If it wasn't successful, though, we're going to do something a little more elaborate. Now, every controller gets access to a messaging object, and when a model fails to save something, for example, it's going to append messages to that list, and then we can display them. And I'm going to change this around because I think it makes it look prettier. I'll put this in front, or we'll do some kind of join operation. So anything that doesn't validate here will be added to messages, and then we'll display those. And then it'll say, sorry, the following problems were generated. And then we have this, which is really unnecessary. This view disabled. This won't try to resolve the rest of it. It probably has more effect when we're dealing with gets. For the moment, I'm going to leave it out, and then we're going to try put it back in. All right. So before, we couldn't register. But now, we should be able to. Nope. No such file or directory. So what that's telling us is that it was unable to connect it to our database. When you see these HY 2002 states, that is almost 99% of the time a connection issue. Alright, so I've got tutorial 1 user, and I'm pretty sure I want his password to be root. Go ahead and reset that and see if... No, we're still getting connection problems. One of the things I'd like to do is I also like to not use localhost when possible as a keyword. And I think my database is named correctly. Go ahead and restart this. And there we go. So there was just a little naming problem. I had to reset that password. We did get an error though. And that's probably because I tried to get this route instead of posting to it. So let's try to post to it this time instead. Ah, thank you for registering. Now, the question ultimately is did anything actually happen? Let's find out. So we pop into MySQL Workbench. Let's go ahead and take a look at that table. So we'll go ahead and select rows. And we see that a user has been created. And just so that we make sure that that's not some kind of fluke, we'll make a second one of me. And then refresh. And there we go. There's 2 of me. And that's ultimately it. You know, once we're at this point, you have a fully functional application and kind of the core pieces to start making something a little bit more exciting. So, and good luck to you. And by all means, the best place to get support is we have forums, and we also have our Discord channel. So you run into little like setup problems like I did, where things were named funny and they weren't resolving correctly. It can be real frustrating to start with. So, you know, one of the reasons I make these videos is it helps me have to intentionally try everything out so that I can go through and enhance the documents where needed and make changes, but also so that maybe you don't have to read them as completely, and that, you know, and maybe in some cases you realize that even when you know what you're doing, you still make mistakes. All right, let's see, how long was that one? That one was only 1 hour and 8 minutes. And there's like at least 15 minutes of waste in there. Okay, this is going on 3 hours. Thank you for paying attention as long as you have and listening to my camera click the whole time. That's what I've been doing. Let's go ahead and export this one. I still think I gotta do this again. Or I'm gonna do some clever editing. That was rough. Okay, any questions, concerns, comments? Just trying to have fun and break stuff. I really do like Phalcon a lot. And even these little nuanced problems I run into, they're all part of the same step. You know, like, we have such great ideas going in here. It's such an impressive background with Zephyr. Such a lot of opportunity here, especially with the way things are going technically, like compiled languages and languages that have just-in-time compilation are back into vogue, you know, like system-level languages. And we care about performance again, because I think the trade-off was at one point we really suffered from development performance just because the web was so hard. Like, just getting a form to submit and save the state in case of an error when we came back was an enormous problem. Now, we don't have that issue. We have different ones. Now we have the fact that we want really, really complicated applications, and we need them to just work. And it's really easy for us to build the client-facing portion, but we're building really slow backends. And so, you know, Phalcon is there to take up that mantle and still be user-friendly. Of course, the trade-off will be is it it will have less syntactic sugar than other frameworks probably will. But it'll attempt to achieve the the performance and scalable goals like the Zen framework does. Which I think is a pretty interesting middle ground to be in, especially in the sense that PHP is relevant. There was a period before when PHP 5 was really starting to age significantly before PHP 7 came out, where PHP had been losing some of its relevance. But Fig and PHP Fig and the community that's around it is really growing, and I'm even getting to the point where I feel very defensible if someone wants to say working with PHP isn't real programming or something. Like, I feel the same defensibility that I do with JavaScript now. I used to get a lot of heck about liking JavaScript, and I still love it. I love all of the frameworks. And people will say to me, that's not real coding. I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. There are very important modern structures that we encounter in JavaScript, which are now being adapted to more what we consider like developer accepted backend languages. When I started seeing async and wait kind of things after I learned about fibers in Ruby, in C#, all of a sudden everyone's like, "Oh, we can finally do this," and then we had the concept of promise architecture in Java, and I was like, these things all came from somewhere, right? Ruby's very core utilization of event machine, which is based on celluloid, which is based on distributed Ruby, which is an amazingly interesting concept. Phalcon has a lot of those things kind of built in. There's some really interesting, very web request handling focused technology here that I could very easily see writing some backend services for data handling and integration, say in Rust or Java or Elixir, right? Say I want to do something, or Erlang. Like, I could see something. This is the fast processing side, and then I could see an aggregation layer that is PHP making client calls, reading from the database, handling requests very deftly. At some point you got to take a look at the ability to do request forwarding, which is just a very clever idea when dealing with what if this request was made but shouldn't go here? Like the ability to create a functional router interface in using forwarding to deliver to multiple backend modules, which then all could be compiled with Zephyr into C. Super clever. It just really exciting things on the horizon. So, I'm about to sign off. If anyone has stayed with me or checked in with me over the last 3-ish hours, greatly appreciated. Love all you very much. I'm going to see if I can get these videos to turn into something meaningful. Maybe not. Otherwise, I'll just be doing this again another time. I probably won't have to live stream it, because I think I'll finally have this scripted down to something really meaningful. But if you have any questions in the meantime, stop and see me in the Discord channel. If you want to see a particular thing that's a video made of something, that's what I'm all about. I mean, that aside, from now I'm going to go back and revise the documentation again with the things I've learned. But that's it. Lovely talking to you, and I'll see you another time.